Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone. We'll just be waiting a few more minutes. Thank you for your patience. In the meanwhile, while we wait for a few more folks to join, please feel free to introduce yourselves. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Saaliha, and I am so honored and excited to see you all here with us today to celebrate and amplify the voices and stories of these incredible Muslimahs leading redistricting across the US, and for you to also learn a little bit more about MIPs, Muslimahs in Policy. I am simultaneously admitting folks from our waiting room, so apologies about that. But yeah, feel free to introduce yourselves, your names, your city, your pronouns if you would so choose, and any affiliation you'd like to share. My name is Saaliha. I am the Chief Advisory Board member for MIPS, Muslimahs in Policy, and we're so glad you're here. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am based in Kansas City, Kansas currently. And I will popcorn it to Mariam.
Salam, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am tuning in from Chicago, but I'm just visiting family here and I'm living in DC. And yeah, excited for this event. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and where you're tuning in from so we can see where everybody's coming in from. And I think, Saaliha, we could just maybe get started now. It's 8:05.
Okay. Maybe we'll just wait like a few more seconds, a few more intros in the chat, and then I still see a lot more people coming in through the waiting room. So we've got more folks coming. Let's just give it another minute. And thank you for introducing yourselves in the chat. If you feel so moved, feel free to do it verbally out loud as well. Dima, I'm going to call on you to introduce yourself as a Rockstar audience member.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dima. I'm from Michigan, but I currently live in Washington, D.C. and am an attorney here and excited to hear more about redistricting. I get to do some of it at work and it's really fun and cool.
Well, welcome again, everybody. We are super excited to have you with us. Folks can keep on trickling in and joining us. I'm again going to welcome you all to our Muslimahs in Policy first inaugural event. We are so excited to have you all with us. We're so grateful for our speakers to volunteer their time and expertise with us. And we're so excited to celebrate them and get to learn more from them about this incredible work that they're doing throughout the country. We'd like to start with a really quick round of housekeeping items, just so you're all in the loop. And so, Mariam, if you could switch the slide. Okay, so quick housekeeping, which everyone already knows by now. We're all nearly zoomed out given the pandemic. Number one, please stay muted unless you're speaking. Number two, please stay engaged in the chat. We would love to continue this engagement that I'm seeing. It's incredible. And number three, please stay connected with us. We are going to be sharing links about what you thought about this event. If you'd like to be part of our team, if you'd like to sign up for our newsletter, and we would so love to stay connected with you. So those are just a couple of quick housekeeping, which you already knew, but just a reminder. And welcome again. Assalamu alaikum. We are so happy to have you here with us. And now it is my honor to introduce to you Medina Javed, who will be kicking us off with a recitation from the Quran. and she has a lovely bio, but let me just share the very, I guess, top sentence. Medina Javed is a Scottish trainee lawyer and a women's rights campaigner living in Chicago, Illinois. She's born and raised in Glasgow, Scotland, and is third generation Scottish. She's well known internationally as a Qariya, reciter of the Quran, and she is a powerhouse. So we're really excited to hear from her.
Assalamu alaikum, good evening, and thank you so much for the warm introduction. Such a pleasure to be here, and such an amazing project and initiative. And I'm really happy to begin this with a recitation from Surah Mu'minun, which means the believers. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قد أفلح المؤمنون الذين هم في صلاتهم خاشعون والذين هم عن اللغو معرضون والذين هم للزكاة فاعلون والذين هم لفروجهم حافظون إلا على أزواجهم أو ما ملكت أيمانهم فإنهم غير ملومين فمن ابتغى وراء ذلك فأولئك هم العادون والذين هم لأماناتهم وعهدهم راعون والذين هم على صلواتهم يحافظون أولئك هم الوارثون الذين يرثون الفردوس هم فيها خالدون صدق الله العظيم. I'll put the translation in the chat box, and I selected this because I know that we wanted something to show what motivates us as Muslims to do this sort of work, and as believers, it's important for us to be a part of all aspects of life and to be doing work like this, as you'll hear today from the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Medina. That was so beautiful and powerful. Jazakallah khair. And now I'd like to introduce to you all Maria Khan, our founding executive director of Muslimahs and Policy. She is based in Los Angeles, California, and working on racial justice work, on redistricting, and on so much more. And she'll share a little bit more about herself and MIPs with you shortly. So I'm handing it over to you, Maria.
Great. Thank you all so much. I'm really excited to be here and to get us started. So after my years of experience of working in policy, one of the most transformative parts has been when I've been able to interact with other Muslims in policy, like Saaliha and Maria, my co-founders. And that's always been a really transformative experience. And so when we all kind of sat down together and we were thinking about MIPS as a space, we talked about having this need to see a space where we're going to be able to bring together the collective power, energy, and joy of the Muslims that we've met working at the forefront of advocacy, civic engagement, government, and policymaking. So we're really excited to bring this space to you all. This is our very first inaugural event, and we just launched this year. In this space, we're hoping that together this can be a space where we're going to learn from one another, where we can support one another and network with each other. So we're really excited to kick off. And so I'm going to go ahead and just introduce the topic of the event a little bit as we get started. Let's go ahead and start pinning, bringing up the speakers to the stage as I do that. So redistricting, that's the first topic that we wanted to bring up and essentially, get going with. Redistricting is the redrawing of the political boundary lines after the census population data is collected every 10 years. I have had the incredible opportunity of working with redistricting in the last cycle, particularly as a demographer for some community groups here in Los Angeles and a little bit throughout, wider in the state as well. And it's a really empowering, but also very emotionally exhausting experience. And I think nonetheless, when you do this work, you come back to just seeing how valuable it can be. Redistricting is really the foundation of so much policy making. So regardless of what issue you care about, whether that's criminal justice or healthcare or education, the foundation of how we go then to make policies happen, to elect the people we want to see in offices, to advocate, starts with how we draw these lines and how we define the communities within these lines, right? And so I'm really excited for the panel that we have today. We have three incredible Muslimahs working across the nation that have really not just worked in redistricting, but have led redistricting efforts, in their work. And so it's an incredible opportunity to have brought them all together here, under one Zoom stage and to engage in this conversation with them. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. So let's just make sure everybody who needs to be pinned is pinned so we can have them all on stage, and then we can go ahead and start.
Yeah, we're good, Maria.
We're good? Okay, Fantastic. Okay, great. So let's hop into it. Obviously, I want to give us all a chance to get to know the incredible panelists that we have here today. So if you all could do me a favor and introduce yourselves with your name, where you're at, and I want you to start us off with the question of, how did you get involved in the redistricting process? And what drew you to this work that at times can be a really crazy roller coaster ride, right? So yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I can jump in and introduce myself. My name is Isra Ahmed. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. And my role in redistricting this cycle was as a commissioner with the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. And how I got involved in the redistricting process this cycle was a complete accident. I heard the call on the radio for the California State Auditor's Office looking for applicants for folks to serve on the Redistricting Commission. I had no idea what it was. I went home and looked into it more, got a deeper understanding. It just also happened that when the ballot measure that gave birth to the Citizens Commission was on the ballot, I was still in high school and ineligible to vote for the actual initiative. So it kind of came around as a surprise to myself, just getting involved in the process and continuously making it through the cuts, eventually leading to one of the 14 seats in which our state and our commission successfully delivered our redistricting maps for our California State Assembly, Senate, Board of Equalization, and congressional districts to the Secretary of State, and it was unanimously passed, and we faced no litigation to date. So it was a complete success from the beginning to the end, certainly with many lessons learned through the process and many ups and downs, but nonetheless an experience of a lifetime. And I'm so grateful to have had that opportunity, and I'm really excited to be here to share more about my experience.
Awesome. Thank you, Isra. My name is Dilara Saeed, and I'm president of the Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition. We're a grassroots organization and an activist organization working with others who do this work across our state and actually across the region of the Midwest. How did I come to this work? Well, I'm a former 8th grade teacher. How many of you remember your 8th grade year? It was US history, remember government, and then literature and language arts. And you often read Abraham Lincoln's speeches, you read Frederick Douglass's speeches. And so the idea of government and our engagement with our government and having voice in it was always something that I'd wanted to learn and I wanted to teach, right? And so what I realized is, boy, as we become, adults in the real world, that voice that we learn about every community gaining in our 8th grade experience in US world history, we don't have it. There are so many invisible communities, so many marginalized communities in our own nation. We'll talk a little bit about Illinois, the largest per capita Muslim population in the nation. We'll talk a little bit about having no representation at the state level or the city of Chicago that identify as Muslim or as South Asian or as Middle Eastern. I mean, so many invisible communities, like I said. And so we brought together dozens of organizations that had been doing social service work, spiritual work, and civic work, and said, wow, collective power is real power. So in 2020, we started building some real power through our census work, through our redistricting work. And then I'm going to give you then the teaser, which is find out how it all ended for Illinois. And you'll find out as we're finishing up in just, this next couple of months will be the last of the city redistricting. And I'll tell you a little bit about how it's going a little later in our program today.
So, hello everyone, my name's Asya Badi. So excited to be here for the inaugural MIPs panel. I am in Manhattan in New York. I'm the Director of Public Engagement for the New York Independent Redistricting Commission, so I'm on the staff side. I came to this because I have a background in public health. I've done a lot of work in various public health initiatives. And a lot of that from a space of looking at social determinants of health and using community engaged planning. I had done some work on the census. And alongside all of my professional work, I actually have been very civically engaged. In New York, I am hold an appointment to a community advisory board. In some states and cities, they're called zoning boards. In New York, you're appointed by your borough president, where in other places it's an election. I came to the community board because if any of you are familiar with the World Trade Center mosque controversy, that was actually at a community advisory board, a zoning board meeting. The board itself was very respectful and felt that the Muslim community had the right, it was an as of right to build the mosque, and they approved it, but it was other people that were protesting. But what they also realized then was the elected officials that there weren't enough Muslims on community advisory boards. And they really felt like it was important to invest and do a call out to encourage Muslims to apply and learn about the system and the structure. And through that, I became super civically engaged and learned a lot. So to the point that many other have said here, it's like you understand how few Muslims there are in spaces and how much it's really important that we're there and we can help guide others. I'm excited to talk about our experience in New York and the learning too. So thanks so much.
Wow, Saaliha, thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. I mean, this is just such a powerhouse of a panel. I love so much about this panel. I love how much courage I can see even just hearing a little bit about your stories and the trajectory of your kind of career into this work. And one of the things that I'm really excited to dive into as our first kind of discussion is, we have this incredible opportunity with this panel where we have 3 different states represented, and each state has a different model for redistricting, right? So we have the Independent Citizens Commission in California, we have the appointed hybrid commission, in New York, and then we also have the state legislature, essentially redistricting commission in Illinois. So, we're looking at different models here. And so that's really exciting because we have this opportunity to kind of talk about what these models looked like in the actual processes and, how that played out. And yeah, I'm really excited to dive into this conversation. I wanted to ask you all, in your experience, obviously the redistricting process is still kind of ongoing, but having had the, a lot of the line drawing kind of been completed for the most part, what's been really valuable about having this format in your state, and or how can it be better? So yeah, it would be great. I'd love it if Isra, maybe you can start us off. In California, this Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission, the way that the model is, it's only really implemented in I believe around 8 states across the nation. So the other 2 models are much more common, right? This is something that's a little bit more of a new model. So can you start us off and talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. And California's model is unique in that sense. So we are an independent citizens redistricting commission. And what that essentially means is we are independent of the legislature, right? So Californians placed by ballot initiative the birth of the commission and put it up to the vote. So voters passed the ballot initiative, which gave birth to the commission. Essentially, we are given a bucket of dollars to complete this task. And once the 14 commissioners are selected, which is a series of application processes, so I had to complete a complete application with essays, with letters of recommendation, with a whole background check. And then once candidates made it through that process and were deemed eligible to serve, which includes, things like being registered for the same political party for the last 5 years from the date of application, or you had to have voted in 2 out of the 3 previous statewide elections to show some level of political activism, right? So once those criteria were met, the pool dwindled down and a selected amount were invited to interviews, which were all live streamed and public. In California, we follow the Bagley-Keynes Open Meeting Act, which requires any state body that makes this type of decision to have meetings that are open and publicly accessible to everyone. So from the inception of the application process to tomorrow's commission meeting about lessons learned, everything is live streamed, publicly accessible, recorded, and posted on our website. The unique part of California's commission is that we are your average voters. So we are not politicians, and we actually, by virtue of serving on the commission, have signed up to not run for any political office for 10 years. So these lines that we drew, we are not eligible to run for any of the seats. So you can see how that removes the gray area, which happens quite frequently in other states where the legislature themselves are drawing these lines in which they turn around and then run for those exact seats. That is not the case here in California. It's completely separated between those who draw these lines and those who can actually run for office. In terms of what can be better or how can it be better, I don't think this is unique to California in the situation that we have been in. A once in a century pandemic occurs at the same time as redistricting. So that posed a lot of barriers for us, unique ways that we had to get in touch with communities that were already hard to reach, right? So being limited to a virtual space really played a role in how we were able to communicate and get in touch with communities to participate within the redistricting process this cycle. Nonetheless, we turned out great participation from across California, a lot of different input, and it was really up to the commission to sit down and try to deduce all of the information, all of the competing priorities that we got to make sense of all of the information and come out with a product that was as fair as possible for this cycle of redistricting.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And just kind of going over even some of those nuances of signing up for the commission. What does that mean? Not being able to run for the next 10 years, and in the greater picture, right? what are we trying to do with these different redistricting models? Because this is something that is such a foundation for how so much policy making happens. So how can we make sure that, you know, going to like our title, right, like that the maps that are being drawn are going to be coming from a fair and equitable kind of mindset. And so I'm really curious now, you know, if Asia, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about what your experience has been and of kind of working in New York where with the appointed kind of commission, which is also an independent commission.
Yeah. And so in New York, for the first time ever, and I know California has had another series, this is the second time their commission is coming through. Our commission was approved after a 2014 ballot amendment that approved a constitutional amendment. And that created the Independent Redistricting Commission. We have 10 commissioners, 4 appointed by the majority legislature, 4 by the minority. The 4 majority currently, which is the Democrats, appointed an independent, and the 4 Republicans appointed a conservative member. So basically after the selected by the legislature, and they would come together with several items that they are tasked with. One is submitting draft plans by September 15th of the year that they were doing that, and then holding 12 public hearings in mandated cities. So for example, it's actually written in the Constitution that the meetings have to happen and they have to be public meetings, and they have to be the commissioners need to have to sit in and be there. So virtual was not an option for us in those places. So it was I'll get into a little bit more, but we had to be, in Buffalo, in Syracuse, in Queens, in those places. And the commission, after that, the final maps would be given to the legislature in early January for the legislature's vote. Just like Isra mentioned, no one knew that there was going to be a COVID pandemic, and we didn't know how that would impact actually the census data. Traditionally, states and redistricting efforts would get the census data that they needed in April of the year that they were doing that. We did not get it till August. I think it was mid-August, August 12th, we got it. And our draft plans had to be made public and aware by September 15th. And we really didn't want to delay given that the rush afterwards. So it really did, it put a lot of pressure. In that time, what the commissioners decided to do is while they were waiting for the census data is to hold 9 virtual public meetings that were all in separate regions across the state, but virtually. And we had some really amazing turnout. I have to say it was really fascinating. We had a ton of people sign up and come and present and also submit testimony, as well as just people who didn't come to do public hearings came and submitted their maps or their ideas. And the commissioners were able to synthesize that testimony for their draft maps and utilize that. And after the draft maps were released on September 15th, we started the series of public hearings. Commissioners added 2 more places, one in Southern Tier and another one up north, that they felt that it was important to hold public meetings in. And a final additional statewide hearing. So it was honestly, it was a really great public first process. I would say we had over 4,000 New Yorkers who participated in a way that really, was exciting and interesting, and they came from all areas. Between we had 600 speakers that came with 12,000 people watching online. And I would say, and then we had 4,500 pages of submitted testimony maps that, the commissioners were able to go through and look at and think about as along with the oral testimony. And not all the people so not everybody that spoke submitted written testimony, but not everybody who submitted written testimony gave oral testimony. So we had a mix of people who did both as well as people who didn't do both and were able to get their voices heard. And I think that's it for now.
Yeah, thank you for that really thorough kind of understanding of, the New York model definitely being one of the, more unique models as well. And it's really great to also kind of hear, you talked a little bit about the history of that being from a legislation that was passed in 2014. And, California too, dating back to its history, this is the second time that we've done it with this model, but it also came from a legislation that was passed by the people. So it's really great to kind of see both that front and back end kind of work work being done on the advocacy side to make this a more, fair redistricting process. And so I'm really excited to have Dilara hop into this conversation as an advocate, yourself, and also coming from, Illinois, where the model that you all have is perhaps one of the most common, right? We're, I think, a little blessed on actually this panel to see some really unique and different models for redistricting, but most of the states are actually dealing with the model that Illinois has. So can you talk a little bit about, that process, what's valuable about it? And I think you'll also have a little bit to contribute to how it can make it better. So I look forward to hearing.
So I'm going to start a little bit and back up in our process. So you're going to get 3 different redistricting models, but what's the same is how we begin thinking about redistricting, and that's through census data. And so every decade, every 10 years since actually 1790, we have been doing a decennial census every 10 years. So about the 7th of each year, so 2007, 2017, it'll loop back up 2027. We start planning the census, how we're going to ask the questions. We want to include everyone, and we want to make sure we understand how the demographics have changed in our nation. But remember what was happening in 2017. Our president did not want to know that the demographics had changed in our nation. Our president wanted a mostly white nation. And so right away, we saw some of the challenges with the census. Arabs who were about to get a law that then allows them to be counted as Arabs. That law was nixed by our President Trump. And then Arabs were going to be counted as white, as they had been for all the decades past. So then we get to the census in 2020. All these different laws get into place. Naturalization question, if you remember that in the news, it was a big deal. Were we going to ask a naturalization question? Are you a citizen of the US or not? Our president said yes, he wanted people to know. That would have scared too many people, and they wouldn't have answered the census. So that was actually considered illegal by the Supreme Court. We get to the 2020 census, we identify demographics. Arabs are still counted as white. We identify where people live in the state, etc. Then we get, after the census data is given back to us, we can then redistrict, which is how we identify the different districts of elections. And we usually try to put segments of demographics together by race so that they can vote people of their own representation into office. So California, 100% independent. That would have been a great model. We also heard from a model that was an independent, a commission that was an appointed commission in the East Coast. In Illinois, it's the traditional model, where what you will have in most states, and that is the state legislature looks at all of the mappings and decides what they're going to change and what they're not. What ends up happening, obviously, we have seen Pennsylvania has gone through this in the litigation, is whatever party is now in control of the states, House and Senate, ends up wanting to district so that their party gets the favorable outcomes of every election for the next 10 years. This time in Illinois, we have the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party in Illinois, unfortunately, is a split between the Latino population and the Black population and the white population. So you'll see headlines coming out of Illinois, Latino caucus versus the Black caucus. You'll see headlines coming out of the state of Illinois, Black population went down. They're trying to fight to keep their numbers equitable and strong. In the city of Chicago, right now, it is Black versus Latino. And we are saying the Asians get one ward, and they're like trying to fight over the boundaries of that ward. All of this is because obviously people in power want to stay in power, and people in power will then redistrict so that that exists in that way. Having said that, and that sounds really cynical, where's our voice then as the people? Well, our voice as the people comes in that we can show up for hearings, we can make sure we're collaborating and giving voice to the work that we've done. The Illinois Muslim Civic Coalition actually attended 40 different hearings, and we have been talking about maps. This is what they look like. We submit maps. We actually have someone create maps looking at census data. Where do Muslims live in Springfield? How can we create different districts that are consolidated? And we submit map after map for different counties across the state. And then these maps are to be taken into account when the legislature creates its maps. Were they not? You know, all of those are, again, in a system like this, it's subjective. Some of the legislators will say, no, we did make an effort to keep Rockford and Champaign together in some areas. Oh, we couldn't do it in other areas because the Latino community or the African-American community or other community was strong. What we were trying to do as activists is not only create our own maps, but do a unity collective map. And what we were telling the legislators is you can't separate the activists between Black and Latino and Muslim and South Asian and East Asian. We're working together and we want you to work together too. So this is some of the challenges, but also the successes. The silver lining out of this cycle between census and redistricting was literally the allyship and the support that organizations gave to each other across systems.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I definitely was a big part of that experience too, of like the coalition building, you know, doing mapping work for community organizations. And yeah, that was one of the most, I think, powerful things that comes out of the process as well. We are going to dive into that topic, but before we do, I want to just backtrack just a little bit to something that, you know, Dilara, you started talking about. You started talking about going back to, you know, the census data itself kind of being collected and the changing population. You know, diving into our Ummah and our community, the American Muslim community is one of the fastest growing religious groups in the nation, right? And we know that in California and New York and Illinois, they have some of the largest Muslim populations. You know, something that was already mentioned is that Illinois ranks around to have the highest at around 1,800 per 100,000, right? Muslim American populations. And, you know, even then, when we think about the American Muslim populations and where they are at, while there are definitely some areas with kind of higher concentration than others, we're not really clustered enough to maybe start making majority districts, right? And perhaps that doesn't even need to be the point. But, you know, for the Muslim communities, like, how can these communities still advocate for being kept together when they're not the majority, when, you know, they may not be in districts that can be totally contiguous, right? One of the infamous rules of, you know, redistricting, wanting to have the lines, you know, connect without breaks. So can you all start talking a little bit about, you know, what submitting those COIs is like, and, you know, why does it matter for our Muslim communities when, you know, as you said, Dilara, you know, talking about some of the larger communities that are very literally looking at maps and trying to carve out those communities that will help them, you know, for kind of future policy making. So yeah, I'd love for you to dive a little bit deeper into that conversation, specifically with the lens of the Muslim community on this topic.
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, so I'm this data geek, so here I am sharing my screen again. Here's that famous map, right? Like Illinois is the largest American Muslim. Really what that means is you are more likely to have a Muslim neighbor in Illinois than in any other state in the nation. There are more Muslims in Michigan and New York, but the population of those states is also larger. And so our per capita is highest in Illinois and Virginia. And Virginia has made some great gains. So we should talk to some people from Virginia as well in the future. So when you go to Illinois and you're more likely to have a neighbor that's in Illinois, where do those neighbors live? Well, certainly there are areas like the southwest suburbs of Cook County where there's a large Arab American population. And certainly they should have opportunities to elect Arab American representation, because right now we have 0 in our state legislature and in our major cities. Certainly there's areas like Devon, and if anyone's visited Chicago, that is a familiar phrase. The South Asian community lives all along the Devon corridor. And so again, should there be representation from the South Asian community, from the Muslim community, et cetera? So the answer is, what we really want is a level playing field. Redistricting is not about coveting the power within a racial demographic alone, or a faith demographic alone, or a specific class demographic alone. Redistricting is supposed to level the playing field so that all communities have representation. We're not there. When the largest per capita state of Muslims in the nation has 0 people in the state legislature that identify as Muslim, we are not there. And this work is critical to help us get there. When the 3rd largest city in the nation, Chicago, has 0 Muslims, 0 Hindus, 0 Buddhists, 0 East Asians, that means Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, nobody. 0 South Asians, 0 Middle Easterners, and 0 African immigrants. That's not a representative city council. So that's why this work is really, really critical. We submit maps, we testify, and we continue now from 2022 to 2028 to the next cycle of the census, talking to legislators, letting them know we're here, telling the American Muslim story and how important it is to the greater American story.
And I would love to hear from either Asia or Isra what your experience was, advocating for the COIs to kind of come through to the cycle on the other end. And I know, there was a lot of effort in both states to kind of also tap into kind of the Muslim community. So I'm curious, in your experience, what kind of role did you see the Muslim communities playing, and what was kind of done to bring them to be kind of more a part of that redistricting process?
I can go. I would just say, like, the biggest thing I would encourage everyone is to participate and really, express your voice. And not just the Muslim communities, but every state is filled with people and organizations and groups of people that make up a community and could be at a community of interest, and people can actually be parts of multiple communities of interest, right? So, it's really about that community deciding that they are a cohesive community and being able to organize and get their voice out there. And I would say in New York, we did see a significant participation by the Muslim community in every area that there was a pool of Muslims. And that happened both within the Muslim community and outside, similar to the way, like said in other places, like, that people presented and spoke out as individuals or as leadership of organizations, of masajids, or as part of a coalition of other groups, both Muslim groups as well as non. So,
yeah, and just to add to that, I think, there's a lot of legal considerations we have to think about when it comes to redistricting and the advocacy part of the process. So under the VRA, religious groups are not a protected class, right? And the question here is really talking about how can Muslim communities still advocate for their communities. So I also would like to, highlight that, your one aspect of your identity is identifying as a Muslim. And you can carry multiple identities and be a part, like just like Asia said, be a part of multiple communities. So finding that common ground across your region to advocate as a cohesive group throughout the redistricting process is absolutely imperative to getting the maps right. Without participation, it makes the jobs of commissioners much more difficult because we are here to serve the communities. And if the communities are not showing up to tell us what is going right, what is going wrong, it really leaves a lot to imagination. So at least in California, there was great participation, with everything going on with the pandemic. We had, couple of months where we were locked indoors for multiple reasons because of the fires and smoke outside and all of the stuff that was going on, Californians still came out in droves to participate in this year's redistricting process.
Wow, yeah, there's so much to unpack in all of that, but I'm gonna touch on the coalition piece that you started talking about, and that all of the speakers have started to touch on. So let's dive into that and let's talk about that. And you mentioned it's sort of the VRA, the Voting Rights Act, right? And that is a monumental legislation that was passed to protect the rights of minority groups in the redistricting process, right? And of course, over the years, the Supreme Court has really started chipping away at a lot of what the VRA also does and how it protects, right, the process that we have. And so, one of the things that I find really beautiful and about like the Muslim community and being as someone who's a part of that is thinking about how diverse our community is, and wanting to capitalize on the fact that we come from a community where we kind of already have this common ground built from all of these different types of people and groups, right? And especially when we think of the Black Muslim community, when we think of the population of the Black population and how we're seeing them being drove out from urban centers right across the nation, which is making it harder to have Black opportunity, Black influence districts across the nation. And what we know about the American Muslim community is that the largest majority are actually Black, right? So 28% of Muslims in America are Black, 23% are Asian, 14% are Arab, and so on, right? But we really are we are like the most diverse religious group. And so I wanted to pose the question of, where in this process did you see kind of like strong coalition building across racial groups in the state? And what do coalition districts mean for redistricting, right? Because we talk a lot about these majority districts, we talk a lot about, opportunity districts, but what do coalition districts, which I think are starting to get talked about more and more in redistricting, what does that mean, right? And what does it particularly mean for these diverse Muslim communities that we have? Any one of you can hop into that question.
It seems coalition building has to be at the heart of what we do. I talked earlier and several of you said that it's not just, about getting elected or redistricting, it's about leveling the playing field. It's about working with each other. So I'm just going to tell you two stories. We're working towards the first Asian ward in Chicago, and it will be a Chinatown ward. Rightly so. We have one of the oldest and most thriving Chinatowns in the nation. And so between Black, white, and Latino wards, we're trying to cut a sliver of one Asian ward, right? And we
like a assembly seat or a city council seat.
Yeah, city council seat is a ward. Okay. Yeah. So we spoke to the Latino caucus, spoke to the Black caucus, and then spoke to the general city council. And we each spoke. There were diverse leaders, and we gave our 2 cents. Now I got a text from two aldermen that said it was basically so cool to watch you advocate for a Chinatown ward, right? So here, and what they meant is you're going to get nothing out of this. You're like this brown hijabi woman who doesn't live in Chinatown, but here you are standing up saying we demand a Chinatown ward. And so that's the story of allyship, right? And I will tell you one more story. We had a press conference on how the state legislature didn't listen enough to community activists and groups. And we had the UCRO leader, Reverend Hood, stand up and say, you don't understand, if you don't change the fact that Arabs are counted as white in the next census, we are all going to be miscounting Americans. And this is a Black Christian leader who I did not say that, but he realized it in the meetings we were having and in the conversations we were having. This is what allyship looks like. This is what coalition building means. Nobody in America has gotten their just due throughout American history until they've stood with allies. And until we stand with our allies, Black, brown, tan, low-income white, rural white, unless we show that we work for them, they have no interest in working with us.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and like, I think rightly so. I think there is so much when we talk about allyship, especially from, the Muslim community. One of the things that I love to see and hope to see kind of more of is when our community comes forward to say, we're willing to go that extra mile and come to you, right? And so that, we can really work together and build this up. I think, yeah, coalition building is just so important. It definitely was a huge part of my experience doing redistricting as well. And I think one of, the most powerful things that can come out of redistricting long term, so long after these maps are drawn, long after, there are these commissions are done with, what they're doing, is these, communities that have built this space, where they're have already built kind of that foundation of being able to kind of advocate. So yeah, I want to give Isra and Asia a chance if there's anything else you want to add to this conversation before we move to our last discussion topic of the day. Great. So since I'm not hearing anything else, I think we've already touched upon so much of that. So that was fantastic. Thank you all for sharing all of that. I wanted to, the last kind of big discussion item that I wanted us to discuss and tap into is when we think about 2020, it's been a unique year in many ways, right? And so, Isra, you yourself talked a little bit about the pandemic and how that, delayed timelines. Asia also touched on that. And so it's been, a challenging year and a challenging couple of years for a lot of reasons, right? 2021 also marks 20 years since 9/11, a tragic anniversary, right? And that for Muslims, it also often, marks a sharp rise in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim rhetoric, which still exists today, right? 20 years later. In one of the reports by ISPU, they found that in the last 4 years, and this is in 2020, 60% of Muslims were reported experiencing religious discrimination, right? And so this is still happening. And so for your work, in redistricting, what importance did this cycle hold, right? Like specifically coming here to this point, what does it mean to have a fair redistricting process? And what do you hope, for the redistricting process in 2030, inshallah, right? I mean, I think one of the reasons we also wanted to have this conversation, and one of the reasons that honestly inspired us to even start an organization like MIPS, is because we had these experiences being involved with the policy process, with the redistricting process, and said to ourselves, okay, here's what we saw in 2020. What are we gonna do now in 2030?
Yeah, I can jump in here and provide just a little bit of what my perspective is on this. So, growing up, I didn't see someone who looked like me in leadership positions, right? I'm a new hijabi, so I blended in more back then, but nowadays it's even harder, right? And so for me, the importance of this redistricting cycle was really about how I could be an active participant within my community to advocate for those who may not have the power to advocate for themselves. And I use the word power very, very explicitly because, we all have a voice, but some voices are just more silenced than others. And I was given this opportunity, one of 14 coveted seats, to make these decisions that are going to last 10 years at least, and ripple effect be much longer beyond that, to try to fight for every community as much as possible, and being in the seat of a commissioner rather than a community advocate or a CBO was definitely different, where you get competing priorities, competing interests. You can get one caller call in and say they want X, and the next caller can immediately request the exact opposite. And then as a commissioner, you're left with making that decision and coming to that conclusion. So it really did require a lot of conversation between the commissioners. And if anyone is interested, we have hundreds and hundreds of hours of our meetings recorded and posted on our website, which was shared in the chat. If you get bored, you can go ahead and watch those. But I think for the future, my hope is that many more people get involved. I saw what happens when people get involved in the process from the beginning of the process, where redistricting was not really a hot topic in the media. It wasn't being covered regularly. The focus was on the census and a whole bunch of other stuff happening in the political world. But once that coverage came to redistricting closer to the deadline, at least here in California, we saw the participation increase substantially, whether that be through written public testimony that was sent to our office or folks calling in to share their thoughts. And that allowed for us to have more robust conversation about very specific lines of which census tracts these lines could go around to honor communities of interest and testimony that was given to us. So my hope for 2030 is that we all get involved and we all get our communities to get involved as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I think I don't think we have said this explicitly, but thank you for being a commissioner on the California state. I think I can, when we think about the Muslim Ummah and our community, for me as well, I reached out to you as a cold call, but it was so exciting to me when I could see somebody who, had the same type of representation and identity as myself represented in that commission. That means so much. So yeah, thank you for the work that you've done. And very excited, to hear about, more involvement, hopefully in 2030. Definitely will be keeping that, in my duas and hopes as well. And I hope that today's conversation is really somewhat of a spark to some of the people here, and maybe even the people who hear this as a recording that will get more involved. Thank you for sharing that, and I'll pass it off to the other speakers.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. And I agree with you, Maria. I think based on your research, it's just me on the staff side in 50 states that's Muslim, and it's obvious Muslim name, and Isra on as a commissioner. So we're hopeful that in 2030, we have a lot more Muslims who are part of this side of the process, as well as more CBOs. So inshallah. And so that rides into the biggest hope is that people participate and understand that, the best way for communities to be effective in a political process is to be visible and organized, and to really, be seen as organized, right? To make sure their voices are heard. And this is especially true of low-income, ethnic, and religious minority communities. So participating in the redistricting process will be really important. And I think participating and organizing for the next 8 to 10 years on many, many things, and hopefully learning the skills so that you can, organize and be part of that redistricting process. The other piece I'll add in, and Isra mentioned that their hours of the meetings are all available online, as are ours. I think, they're really interesting to look at and see how people talked about their communities and what was important. And all of our submissions are also online, public submissions. Luckily, I know California got a ton more than us, but it's amazing to go through, and I think it's really interesting. I think it's interesting not just to see Muslim communities' responses, but also other communities you have a lot to learn from. And I think you can see how different communities spoke about what they felt that was really important to them.
Asi, I want to appreciate what you just said, because that is coalition building. It's not just advocating for each other because we know the other deserves something or whatever. It's actually just learning from each other too. I can't tell you how much we've learned because our community and in its organizing is relatively newer than others, right? Maddie, to your question, I think you're asking us like the why, like, why are we doing this? Why is this work really critical? And we have our most downloaded, so over 13,000 copies of this have been disseminated over the last couple of years. And it's the American Muslim story within the greater American story. And so what we've done is from 1600 to 2020, identified like in this timeline, what were Muslims doing in America during this time? And the most powerful thing that most legislators tell us about this, number one, is how diverse we are. And here it says racially, ethnically, politically, professionally, class-wise, Muslims are some of the wealthiest people in the nation and some of the poorest people in the nation. In every way, we are diverse. And secondly, they had no idea we've been here since the 1600s. You talked about the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Do you know how many people think we came right around that time? Over 20% of African enslaved peoples that were brought into this colonies were identified as Muslim. So this country was built as much by Muslims as by any other community. And our allies take this and share this at events because they want to say this question: where does your story intersect on this timeline? I've had Irish people tell me, oh, my great grandfather came in the late 1890s. Look, this is what Muslims were doing in America in the late 1890s. And so this is the way we own our narrative. We learn our narrative ourselves, our children, our grandchildren, and then we share our narrative with those who are our neighbors. And this is why census matters, redistricting matters. And this is why MIPS is such an exciting organization, because it is Muslimahs changing policy and telling our narrative and then advocating for everybody, saying Muslims are doing this work, but we're doing work that's good for every American, not just Muslim Americans, certainly, but for every American. So that's exciting. So thank you, MIPS, for having us and letting us tell our stories.
No, for sure. I mean, thank you all so much for kind of, walking us through that. And I thought I was going to be the data geek on the panel today, but, Zara, I've loved you, sharing with us the maps and the data and all of the different kind of graphs and stuff you're, sharing with us today. But I have to say, as somebody who is a data analyst by profession, and this is what I do, as much as I love data, I truly still see so much of the power and so much of just the collective energy that comes together from, leaders like yourself, Dilara, like Asia, like Isra, that are making some of, I think, the biggest strides for our community, are making some of the biggest differences in the political process. It's the people that are willing to put themselves really on the front lines of the policy process, because, as I said in the beginning, this is not easy work, right? I mean, this work is really exhaustive, not just physically, but I think also really emotionally, right? It takes a lot to kind of go out there and start figuring out, what does fair mean? What does redistricting mean, right? For all of this. And so, but I feel really grateful that we've had a chance to discuss all of that and just start scratching some of the surface on our first MIPS panel. We're gonna now stop the recording and we're gonna open up for some questions from the audience. So thank you to everyone who's joined. We're really excited to have you here. If you have questions,